Let me be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not speculation dressed up in dramatic language. And it is not the kind of breathless rumor that gets passed around on social media before disappearing into the void. What you are about to hear is the logical conclusion of a military and geopolitical situation that has been building for decades. And when you understand the full architecture of what the United States has been trying to do in the Middle East, and specifically what it has been trying to do to Iran, then what allegedly happened with those Delta Force operators stops sounding shocking and starts sounding almost inevitable. So stay with me, because the first few minutes of this conversation are going to reframe everything you think you understand about American power, Iranian strategy, and why the gap between what Washington tells you and what Washington actually does has never been wider or more dangerous. Here is where we start. The United States does not go to war the way it tells you it goes to war. There is the public version, the press conferences, the congressional authorizations, the generals standing at podiums talking about rules of engagement and coalition partners and humanitarian objectives. And then there is the operational version, which runs on a completely different set of rules, answers to a completely different chain of command, and operates in a shadow space that is deliberately designed to give political leadership what intelligence professionals call plausible deniability. Special operations forces, and Delta Force in particular, live and work entirely inside that shadow space. They are the sharp edge of American imperial ambition, the instrument that gets used when the White House wants a result but cannot afford to have its fingerprints on the process. And when a president wants to win, wants to deliver a decisive blow, wants to change the facts on the ground in a way that his advisors promise him will be quick and clean and conclusive, that is when Delta Force gets the call. Now let us talk about Trump, because understanding his decision-making psychology is essential to understanding how an operation like this could have been authorized. Donald Trump is not a strategic thinker in the traditional military sense. He does not come from a background of patient, long-game geopolitical calculation. What he responds to is leverage, dominance, and the appearance of strength. His entire political identity is built around the idea that America has been weak, that its enemies have been laughing at it, and that he, uniquely, personally, has the will to restore the kind of fear-based respect that makes adversaries back down. That is not an analysis of his character designed to diminish him. That is a structural description of how he processes foreign policy decisions, and it matters enormously when you are trying to understand what kind of military options he would have found appealing when it came to Iran. Iran represents something very specific in the American political imagination, and particularly in the conservative political imagination. It is the country that humiliated the United States in 1979. It is the country that took American diplomats hostage and held them for 444 days, while a sitting president watched his presidency collapse in real time. It is the country that has spent 45 years systematically building influence across the Middle East through Hezbollah in Lebanon, through allied militias in Iraq, through its support for the Houthi movement in Yemen, through its strategic relationship with Syria, and through a nuclear program that Israel and the United States have spent billions of dollars and decades of covert operations trying to stop and have not stopped. If you are Donald Trump and you want to deliver the kind of decisive, visible, undeniable victory that reshapes the strategic landscape and proves that American power is back, Iran is the target, Iran has always been the target. But here is where the story gets far more complicated than any headline can capture. And if you think you already know where this is going, I promise you that what comes next is going to change your analysis completely. The problem with Iran, the problem that American military planners have been wrestling with for a generation, is that Iran is not Iraq. It is not Libya. It is not Afghanistan. It is not a state that can be decapitated with a single strike, or destabilized with a no-fly zone, or shocked into submission with a rapid ground invasion. Iran is a civilization. It has been a functioning, organized, strategically sophisticated state for longer than the United States has existed by a factor of roughly 50. Its military doctrine is built specifically around the assumption that it will face a technologically superior adversary, and it has spent 40 years designing asymmetric responses to exactly that scenario. Its intelligence services are among the most capable in the region. Its counterintelligence apparatus is deeply embedded, highly motivated, and battle-tested from decades of operating in an environment where foreign powers The United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and others are actively trying to penetrate, subvert, and destroy it. When American Special Operations Forces enter the operational space that Iran controls or monitors, they are not entering enemy territory in the way that they might have been entering Taliban-controlled areas of Afghanistan. They are entering a space where the adversary has been preparing specifically for their arrival. This is the part that the people celebrating any hypothetical operation against Iran consistently fail to account for. American Special Operations capability is genuinely extraordinary. Delta Force represents decades of accumulated expertise, training, and operational experience. These are not ordinary soldiers. But extraordinary capability operating against a prepared, sophisticated, highly motivated adversary in that adversary's home environment is a completely different proposition than extraordinary capability operating against a fragmented insurgency in open terrain. The Iranians have spent decades studying American Special Operations doctrine. They have studied every publicly available account of how Delta Force operates. They have studied the lessons of failed operations, including the catastrophic 1980 Desert One rescue mission, which ended in disaster in the Iranian desert, and which Iran has analyzed with extraordinary care precisely because it demonstrated American vulnerabilities. They have built their counterintelligence and their military response architecture around the specific goal of being ready when American operators arrive on their soil or in their operational sphere. So when you hear that an operation was mounted and that it went wrong, and that Iranian forces captured a significant number of American Special Operations personnel, and 60 is a number that, if accurate, represents a catastrophic operational failure by any historical standard, the question you should be asking is not simply what happened in the immediate tactical sense. The question you should be asking is how this happened, why the risk calculus was so badly miscalculated, who told the president this was going to work, and what the people who gave that advice understood about Iranian capability and chose not to adequately communicate to the decision makers who authorized the mission. Because here is a truth about American foreign policy that the mainstream media consistently refuses to engage with honestly. The gap between what intelligence analysts know and what political decision makers hear is not accidental, it is structural. Analysts who tell powerful political figures what those figures want to hear get promoted. Analysts who deliver accurate but inconvenient assessments get sidelined, ignored, or forced out. This pattern has repeated itself across administration after administration, across party lines, across decades of American foreign policy failure. It happened in Vietnam, it happened in Iraq, it happened in Afghanistan. The institutional incentive inside the American national security apparatus consistently rewards optimism about American capability and consistently discounts the capacity of adversaries to resist, adapt, and fight back. And if something like what is being described here actually occurred, if American operators were captured in significant numbers, then you are looking at the most recent and potentially the most consequential expression of that same institutional failure. Stick with me, because the implications of what I am about to lay out in the next section are the part that changes everything, not just for this operation, but for the entire trajectory of American power in the Middle East over the next decade. Let us think for a moment about what Iran capturing 60 Delta Force operators would mean strategically, because this is not just a military question. It is an economic question, a political question, and a deeply personal question for every single American who has been told that their country's military dominance is so complete and so overwhelming that adversaries simply cannot compete. The capture of special operations forces at that scale would represent the single most significant American military humiliation since the fall of Kabul. It would be larger in its implications than the capture of the USS Pueblo by North Korea in 1968. It would be larger in its implications than the Iranian hostage crisis, because those were diplomats, civilians operating under a different set of rules and a different set of expectations. Capturing 60 members of the most elite counterterrorism and direct action force in the American military would be a demonstration, visible to every government in the world, that American special operations power, the cornerstone of American force projection in the post-Iraq era, has a ceiling, and that ceiling can be reached by a sufficiently prepared and motivated adversary. Think about what that signal sends to every other country that is currently calculating whether American power is worth deferring to. Think about what it sends to China, which is watching every American military engagement in the Middle East as a data point in its own long-term assessment of whether the United States can sustain its global military commitments. Think about what it sends to Russia, which has been arguing for years that American military power is more bluster than substance. Think about what it sends to the smaller states across Southeast Asia, across Africa, across Latin America, that are currently deciding whether to align with American-led institutions or whether to begin building relationships with alternative power centers. The capture of those operators, if real and if confirmed, does not just affect the Iran file. It ripples across every single geopolitical calculation that every single government on the planet is making right now about the reliability and the invincibility of American force. And then there is the domestic political dimension, which is where things become truly extraordinary. Because Donald Trump built his entire political brand on strength, on winning, on the idea that under his leadership, America does not get humiliated. America does not lose. America does not send its finest warriors into a situation and watch them get captured by an adversary that Washington has spent decades portraying as a second-rate regional power kept afloat only by oil revenue and theological fanaticism. If something like this happened, and if it happened under his watch, and if it became public, the contradiction between the brand and the reality would be so severe, so total, and so undeniable that the political consequences would be impossible to manage. Which is precisely why, if something like this happened, every institutional pressure within the American government would be pushing in exactly one direction: suppress it, classify it, deny it, and make sure it never reaches the public in a form clear enough to force accountability. And that is exactly where you need to focus your attention right now, because the suppression of information about military failure is not a new phenomenon in American history. It is a well-documented, institutionally embedded practice that has been used repeatedly to protect political leadership from the consequences of catastrophic decision-making. The American public did not get the full truth about the Gulf of Tonkin incident until decades after it was used to justify the escalation of the Vietnam War. The American public did not get the full truth about what intelligence was available before the invasion of Iraq until years after the country had been destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people had died. The American public did not get the full truth about the strategic failures in Afghanistan until the Taliban was already back in Kabul, and the last American transport planes were lifting off from a runway surrounded by chaos. The pattern is consistent, the pattern is deliberate, and the pattern is repeating itself right now in real time with whatever actually happened between American Special Operations Forces and Iranian military and intelligence units in the operational theater that has been quietly escalating for months. Here is what you need to understand about how these cover-ups work mechanically, because understanding the mechanics is the only way you can begin to see through them. The first tool is classification. When an operation goes badly wrong, the immediate institutional response is to classify everything associated with it at the highest possible level, not because the classification genuinely protects ongoing operational security, although that justification will always be offered, but because classification removes the information from any arena where accountability can be demanded. Congressional oversight committees can request classified briefings, but those briefings happen behind closed doors. The members who receive them are legally prohibited from discussing what they hear publicly, and the executive branch retains enormous discretion over how much detail it actually provides, even in those closed settings. The second tool is narrative management. If enough fragments of the story leak out through foreign media, through intelligence services of allied countries, through soldiers or their families, the institutional response is to flood the information space with competing narratives, alternative explanations, and aggressive denials delivered with enough confidence and authority that the average person consuming news has no reliable way to evaluate which account is accurate. But here is the thing, and this is the part that directly affects you, your money, your security, and your understanding of the world you're actually living in. The consequences of this kind of failure do not stay classified. They bleed out into the real world in ways that are completely visible if you know where to look. Let us talk about what the financial and economic consequences of a major American military humiliation in the Iran theater actually look like. because this is where the story stops being abstract geopolitics and starts being something that lands directly in your life. The United States dollar's position as the world's reserve currency is not maintained by the inherent virtue of American economic management. It is maintained fundamentally by the perception that American power, military power above all else, is reliable, overwhelming, and durable enough that the global financial system built around dollar dominance is safe to participate in. Every country that holds dollar reserves, every country that prices its oil exports in dollars, every country that settles its international trade in dollars is making a bet that the American military umbrella is real and that the American state is stable enough to honor its commitments. When that perception takes a serious hit, when the military that underpins dollar dominance is seen to have failed visibly and significantly, the incentive to begin diversifying away from dollar exposure increases for every government making that calculation simultaneously. We have already been watching this process unfold in slow motion for years. The BRICS expansion, the gradual increase in bilateral trade settlements conducted in local currencies rather than dollars, the acceleration of Chinese yuan internationalization, the gold accumulation by central banks across the global south, all of these are expressions of the same underlying calculation, which is that dollar dominance is not permanent, that the American military guarantee is not infinite, and that building alternative financial infrastructure now is prudent risk management for any government that wants to retain strategic autonomy. A major confirmed American military failure in the Iran theater does not create this trend, but it accelerates it. It provides a concrete, visible, undeniable data point that every finance minister and every central bank governor can point to when making the internal case for reducing dollar exposure. The geopolitical and the financial are not separate systems. They are the same system, and what happens on a battlefield or in an intelligence operation has direct, measurable consequences for the value of the currency in your bank account and the price of everything you buy. And if you think the dollar vulnerability angle is the most unsettling part of this story, I need you to stay right here, because what the Iranian capture scenario reveals about the broader American strategic position in the Middle East is something that should genuinely alarm every person who has been told that American dominance in that region is secure and self-sustaining. Iran's strategic position in 2025 is fundamentally different from its strategic position even 5 years ago, and the American national security establishment has consistently failed to communicate the full scope of that transformation to the public. The destruction of Hezbollah's upper leadership by Israeli operations created a short-term tactical win, but did not eliminate the underlying infrastructure that Iran has spent 4 decades building across the region. The Houthi campaign in Yemen, which has demonstrably disrupted global shipping through the Red Sea and forced the rerouting of enormous volumes of international trade, has demonstrated that Iranian-aligned forces can impose real economic costs on the global system without requiring direct Iranian military engagement. The network of allied militias across Iraq and Syria remains intact, battle-hardened, and deeply embedded in the political and security structures of those countries in ways that no air campaign or special operations raid can simply erase. And Iran's nuclear program, whatever its current status, has advanced to a point where the technical distance between where Iran is and where it would need to be to produce a nuclear device has narrowed to a degree that changes every strategic calculation in the region. What this means is that the American approach of using special operations forces and targeted strikes to manage Iranian power, the approach that has been the cornerstone of American Middle East policy for the better part of 2 decades, is running into a structural ceiling. You cannot special operate your way out of a situation where the adversary has successfully distributed its strategic assets, built genuine popular legitimacy in multiple countries, developed meaningful economic leverage through its ability to threaten critical shipping routes, and advanced its deterrent capability to the point where a conventional military confrontation carries risks that even the most hawkish voices in Washington are not fully prepared to accept. The tools that American power has been relying on are not producing the results that American policymakers promised, and the people paying the price for that gap between promise and reality are the operators being sent into those environments, and the ordinary Americans whose security and prosperity depend on a foreign policy that is actually grounded in an accurate assessment of what American power can and cannot achieve. Let us be very specific about the human dimension of this, because it gets lost in the strategic abstraction, and it should not. Delta Force operators are not abstractions. They are human beings who volunteered for the most demanding and dangerous service their country offers, who have families, who have sacrificed enormous amounts of their personal lives to develop the extraordinary capability that makes them valuable, and who depend absolutely and completely on the people who give them their orders, having made an honest, rigorous, and realistic assessment of the risks they are being asked to accept. When political leadership authorizes an operation because they want a win, because they need a political narrative, because their advisors have told them what they wanted to hear rather than what the intelligence actually supported, and when that operation fails and those operators pay the price, the failure is not primarily military. The failure is moral. It is a failure of the people at the top of the decision-making chain to take seriously their obligation to the human beings they are sending into harm's way. Because what comes next, what the aftermath of a failure of this magnitude looks like diplomatically, militarily, and economically, is the part of this story that will define American foreign policy for years, and you need to understand it clearly. The diplomatic consequences of a confirmed capture of American Special Operations Forces by Iran would be unlike anything the United States has navigated in the modern era, because it creates an immediate and extraordinarily difficult hostage negotiation scenario in a political environment that is almost perfectly designed to make negotiation impossible. On the American side, any administration would face enormous domestic political pressure to take a hard line, to refuse to negotiate, to demand unconditional release, and to threaten escalating military responses, because negotiating with Iran over captured American soldiers looks, in the domestic political imagination, like weakness, like appeasement, like a repeat of the humiliations of the Carter era. On the Iranian side, 60 captured American Special Operations personnel represent a strategic asset of incalculable value, not primarily as bargaining chips for immediate concessions, but as a long-term demonstration of Iranian capability and American vulnerability, and as leverage that can be deployed across multiple dimensions of the ongoing confrontation between the two countries. Iran has historically been extraordinarily patient and sophisticated in how it uses leverage. It does not always cash in assets immediately. Sometimes it holds them, allows the pressure to build, allows the domestic political cost on the American side to accumulate, and then deploys the asset at the moment of maximum strategic advantage. That patience is a function of a strategic culture that thinks in decades and centuries rather than in news cycles and election calendars. And it is exactly the kind of strategic patience that American political culture, with its 4-year election cycles, its 24-hour news environment, its institutional bias toward action and visible results, is structurally least equipped to deal with. The economic dimension connects directly to what I was describing earlier about the dollar and about global confidence in American power. But there is a more immediate economic angle that deserves specific attention, which is oil. Any significant escalation in the Persian Gulf, any scenario that creates genuine uncertainty about the security of oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes, produces immediate severe upward pressure on global energy prices. And energy prices are not an abstraction for the people watching this video. They are what you pay at the gas pump. They are embedded in the cost of everything that gets transported, which is everything. And they are a primary driver of the inflationary pressures that have been grinding down real wages and real living standards for ordinary working people across the Western world for the past several years. A military confrontation with Iran is not just a foreign policy problem. It is an economic problem that lands directly on your kitchen table. What I want you to take away from everything we have covered today, from the structural failure of American decision-making to the Iranian strategic position to the financial and economic consequences, is this. The story of what may have happened with those Delta Force operators is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom. It is a symptom of a foreign policy architecture that has been built on systematically overstating American capability, systematically understating adversary capability, systematically insulating political decision makers from the honest consequences of their choices, and systematically asking the people at the sharp end, the operators, the soldiers, the ordinary citizens whose taxes fund these operations and whose security depends on their success, to pay the price for decisions made by people who face no personal consequences when those decisions go wrong. Until that structural problem is addressed honestly and directly, the pattern will repeat. The names will change, The geography will shift, the specific operational details will differ, but the underlying dynamic, the gap between what power promises and what power delivers, will keep producing the same results. And the people who will keep paying the price are the ones who were never given an honest account of the risks in the first place. That is what this story is really about. And that is why you needed to hear it.